Sally, some school districts like Las Cruces, Gadsden, Deming, Los Lunas, they've all postponed their summer workouts until next week, July 13th. Do all school districts have to wait?
No, that is a school district decision. It came out from the Texas Association, the UIL, that they were going to suspend summer workouts right around the July 4th holiday, just in case kids were at parties and family outings and not to bring the virus into their practices. So they suspended for a couple weeks. When that came out, some of our school districts thought it was a great idea. So they decided to suspend their summer workouts for a couple weeks. But again, that is a school district decision.
Will we see high school athletics if schools are in a hybrid model where it's some in-person learning and some remote virtual learning?
I think that's to be determined. I will have a meeting today and talk to the superintendents. I also have a survey to go out to superintendents because ultimately it's probably their decision. You know, we talk about transportation. If kids are at school, it's easy to practice. If they're not at school that day, can they get back to practice after school? And I think that's a superintendent's decision. And so I will be talking to them and getting their feedback before that decision is made.
When do you think teams can open up their pod size from a 5-to-1 ratio to something that's larger?
I think we're waiting on the governor. You know, when she moves to phase 2, if she opens up a little bit, then maybe we can go to 10-to-1, 15-to-1 pod size. But at this time, since we are, you know, the phase hasn't opened up, and hopefully we don't reverse, you know, because that's a possibility, but it will be depending on when the governor decides to go to phase 2.
While we're on the topics of pods, can you clarify the use of equipment in a pod, like with football or volleyball?
And I think that has changed. You know, from the beginning we had no equipment. And then we opened it up a little bit to, you know, minimal equipment use. But I think the coaches are getting the hang of it, and they're very professional and understand that they need to keep everything sanitized within a pod. So when you talk about equipment, there can be equipment use, but it has to be within that pod. You know, we have a football and they can throw the football to everybody within the pod, but it cannot go from one pod to the other. So I think sanitizing, doing it properly, understanding that it just needs to be in a small group, and equipment is fine.
With the governor's new guidelines about out-of-state travel, does the 14-day quarantine apply to those who drive now instead of fly?
It does, and that has changed, you know, within the past week. And last week I did send an email right away to the athletic directors and the coaches, understanding that we're not only in a 14-day quarantine when they fly, we're now in a 14 quarantine when somebody drives. So that is going to affect some of these kids that are going across the border for maybe a baseball, softball tournament, or they're going on a family vacation. Whether they drive or fly, they must have a 14-day quarantine period.
What about the kids and families that left the state before that quarantine order was issued?
Well, you know, that was the first question that came up, like, hey, I'd left the state under these guidelines and I'm returning under new guidelines. I did ask the governor's office that question, and when they return, whatever guidelines are in place, not when they leave, when they return, whatever guidelines are in place is what they need to follow. So those folks that left the state under one guidelines and are returning right now, they will have a 14-day quarantine whether they drive or fly.
What if someone leaves town, returns, has a COVID test, and those results are negative? Can they then return to workouts?
The COVID test does not replace the 14-day quarantine. And I know some parents and some of them thought, hey, let me go get a test. If I'm negative, I get to practice. It doesn't replace. So at this point, if you leave the state, whether you drive or fly, you have a 14-day quarantine period.
How often can you change the athletes within a pod?
I think, again, like I said, professional. You know, our coaches are so professional and they understand the whole idea of the guidelines. The guidelines are to minimize contact, you know, from one kid to another. And so, you know, when you constantly change pods, then you're not minimizing the contact for these kids. You know, these kids could then be, instead of with 5 other people, they could be 10, 15, 20 other people if you keep changing pods. So I think it's a good idea to keep the pods together. What is the time frame? Again, that's up to the coach. I still think maybe a 2-week time period to make sure that they're in the pods within a 2-week time period is best, just because of that 14-day, we always say 14-day quarantine, 14-day, with contact tracing and isolation. So I would say a 2-week period that they need to be in those pods. And then I think you could change a little bit minimally if you need to, but it would just be best to keep the same pods.
Should a coach try to keep siblings in the same pod, or a coach and their own child in the same pod?
We found that out. That's a good question, because we did have a situation where we had a family. It's not the kids that were participating, but we had a family, the father or mother, and I don't remember which one it was, tested positive for COVID. And so then we had the 2 kids in that household. Well, at the situation, when you look at contact tracing, now you're looking, okay, who did these kids come in contact with? Now, if they were in the same pod, there would only be 3 other kids. But if they're in different pods, now you're talking about, 9 other people that they may have been in contact with. And so you want to make sure that you think about those things, and yes, it is best to keep the siblings in the same pod.
And you've been meeting with coaches to keep the open lines of communication going. What have you been telling them? And lastly, where are we right now?
Staying positive. I keep saying that, JP, and sometimes it is, you come to work some days and you're not as positive as others, and this, like we always said, it's fluid, it's ever changing. But I think at the end, if we're communicating with the coaches, I'm going to communicate with the superintendent and all the athletic directors and kind of weigh in, where are we at, what are the feelings, and just trying to find out how can we make sure that we have sports in the school year 2021. What does that mean? I've said since the beginning of March, that is my goal. My goal is to make sure we do have all sports and all kids can compete in 2021. What that looks like, we still don't know. I do believe that here in the next couple weeks, I've been saying mid-July, JP, and I'm going to keep my word. Mid-July is coming around the corner, and we have to make some determinations. But once we weigh in from all the players out there, and I'm not saying players as far as athletes, I'm saying athletic directors, superintendents, headmasters, coaches, once we get all that information, then I think a good concrete decision can be made. Is it going to be ideal? No, it's not going to be ideal. We're in a different world in this 2021 school year. However, we can play again. I keep saying that, JP, we can play again, and that's the goal, that everyone gets to compete in 2021. And when that decision is made, everybody will be on the same page, and we all stay positive, because it is going to happen.